Hi guys, welcome to Murder in the Midwest. I'm Brooke, and if you're new to my channel, I talk about mainly unsolved homicides that have occurred in small Midwestern communities. Occasionally I talk about missing persons or just odd cases as well that strike my fancy. Today we're going to be talking about the oldest cold case I have ever covered on my channel. It is over 100 years old, and it's probably one of the more well-known cold cases as well. We're going to be talking about the Villisca axe murders that occurred in Villisca, Iowa, back in June of 1912. So to set the stage for you a little bit, if you're not sure where Villisca, Iowa is, if you look at a map of Iowa, it is in the very southwestern corner of the state. It very closely borders Missouri and also Nebraska. And we're gonna go all the way back to the early 1900s. Back in the early 1900s, Villisca, Iowa was a thriving community. It had a population of around 2,500. They were on a major railroad line, so they had a train depot there, and they had businesses lining the downtown area. Now, the family that was the victims of these axe murders was the Moore family. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about them, as well as the two girls that were spending the night at their house, the Stillinger sisters. So 8 victims total of these axe murders, and the killer's never been caught. So Josiah Moore and Sarah Moore were husband and wife. Josiah went by Joe, so that's what I'm going to call him. He was 43 at the time of his death, and Sarah was 39. Together, they had 4 children: Herman, who was 11, Mary Catherine, who was 10, Boyd, who was 7, and Paul, who was only 5 years old. Now, the night that this murder occurred, Mary Catherine had her 2 friends spending the night. That was Ina and Lena Stillinger. Lena was 12 years old and Ina was only 8. So to set the scene of what occurred that day, so Sarah Moore was very involved in the Presbyterian Church, and they did something every year called the annual Children's Day program. So the Children's Day program started at approximately 8 p.m. on June 9th, 1912. Sarah was involved in helping to plan and run this program. All of her kids also had parts in the program, as well as Ina and Lena Stillinger. So it just made sense, since this program started at 8 and it didn't get over till almost 10, that they would spend the night at the Moore family home. So that's what they did. They put on this program. The congregation was there. Joe was in the audience watching his wife and his children. They got home probably approximately around 9:45 to 10 p.m. And then the next morning, their neighbor, her name was Mary Peckman, she gets up around 5 a.m. She's outside hanging up her laundry, starting her chores, and she realizes that around 7 a.m., she hasn't seen a single member of the Moore family come out of the house, which was highly unusual because back then, you were starting your chores at sunrise. They had a barn that was fairly close to their home, and their livestock was still tied up. None of them had been fed. The chickens hadn't been let out of the chicken coop. So Mary was a little concerned. So she goes over to the Moore home, knocks on the door, calls out for them. Nobody comes to the door. She tried to get in the front door, but it was locked, which that really alarmed Mary because they apparently didn't lock their doors, as most people in small towns at that time didn't. And so she became concerned. So she went back to her house and she called Joe's brother Ross, just to ask him if there was any reason that the family would be out of town, that they wouldn't be up and out of the house. Obviously, Ross didn't know of any reason why they wouldn't be up. He became concerned, so he said, you know what, I'm gonna come over. I have a spare key to the house, so I'll go inside and see what's going on. So Ross arrives. He tells Mary to wait on the front porch. He gets out his spare key, opens the front door. If you've never seen pictures of the Moore family home, I am going to put up still pictures, and I'm also going to link a video from a fellow YouTuber who actually took video of the outside and the inside of the home. It is a very small house, so it's actually amazing to me that 8 people were spending the night in there, plus a killer was moving around inside. So these are little tiny rooms. So when you open and enter the front door, there's a room right off to the side that was the guest bedroom, which is where Lena and Ina Stillinger had been spending the night. Ross noticed that the door was closed, so he went in and opened the door, and really all he could see, he could tell that 2 people were laying in that bed, and there was a bed sheet covering them and covering their heads, but he could see blood seeping through, and there was blood everywhere in the room. So he nopes out of there really quick. Like, he backs up, he goes out to the front porch, tells Mary to call the police. Mary gets on the phone, she calls the sheriff. He comes over, and he also brings with him a family doctor, the coroner. They start to go through the home, and they discover that every single member of the Moore family, as well as the Stillinger girls, had been bludgeoned to death. Now, there is an axe sitting in the home that had been wiped down. There was still some blood and other matter on it, but they assumed that that was probably the murder weapon. And guys, this is a really gruesome scene. As you can imagine, head injuries bleed a lot, and each member of that family had been bludgeoned 20 to 30 times apiece. So there is blood everywhere. Now, with Villisca being such a small town, when news of this got out, the police basically lost complete control of the crime scene. They actually had to end up calling the National Guard. There was a National Guard armory in Villisca at the time. The National Guard had to come and actually secure the crime scene, but they didn't get there till about noon. By the time they actually got there and were able to kind of cordon off everything, about 100 people is estimated had traipsed through the outside of the house, the inside of the house. So, you know, that's obviously not good for evidence sakes. But they finally got control of the crime scene. And here's some just odd details of the scene and what they found. So what they knew is that 8 people had been bludgeoned to death. So 2 adults being Joe and Sarah, and then 6 children. Their 4 children, and then Ina and Lena Stillinger. Presumably, they assumed the axe that was left at the crime scene was the murder weapon. It appeared that all of the victims had been asleep at the time of the murders. The only one that they thought maybe had woken up was Lena Stillinger, who was in that downstairs guest bedroom with her sister Ina. The reason they thought this is because her body had some defensive wounds on her arms, and her body was also kind of laying crossways across the bed. They also noted that her nightgown had been pushed up above her waist, and they couldn't find any undergarments around. They don't know for sure if she was sexually assaulted or not. They don't think she was, but just from the position of the body and the fact that her nightgown had been pushed up with no underwear, they thought perhaps that had been a motive of the crime as well. One thing that was kind of weird is that not only were all the curtains drawn, which that's not weird, that's, you know, they probably drew them before they went to bed, but 2 of the windows in the Moore house didn't have curtains on them, and the killer had hung up bed sheets over the windows, as well as covered up all the mirrors in the house. Had put like sheets or blankets over all the mirrors, which is odd. All the victims' faces were covered with either sheets or clothes, and the killer did this after he had already bludgeoned them to death. So I remember reading that one of the victims had like a gray coat over her face. One of the little girls had a little dress over her face. So kind of odd, right? This is the other thing that's weird. So obviously kerosene lamps were used for lighting in these homes that didn't have electricity. So there was a kerosene lamp that was found at the foot of Joe and Sarah's bed. And the chimney, so if you've ever seen a kerosene lamp, if you haven't, I'll put up a picture of one looks like, but they have like these glass lamps on them that they call the chimney. The chimney was actually taken off and the wick had been turned back. The chimney was found under the dresser. Also, a similar kerosene lamp was found at the foot of the bed of the Stillinger girls. So in their downstairs bedroom, there was another kerosene lamp, the chimney was taken off and the wick was turned back. They're estimating that the time of death for everybody was somewhere between midnight and 5 a.m. And they were basing that on the fact that they knew when this Children's Day program ended, and they knew when the Moore family had started to walk home from the church. And then obviously with their neighbor Mary waking up at 5 a.m. and she'd been outside the whole time, she hadn't seen anybody come out of the home. That's really how they got the time of death. The murder weapon, which was the axe, that was found at the foot of the bed in the Stillinger girls' bedroom. It was bloody, but an attempt had been made to wipe it off, and this axe had actually belonged to Joe, which was very common. Most families had an axe because they're doing chores. Where the axe was left that night, we don't know for sure, but it was very common for people to leave their axes outside in their yard, or they did have a barn that was nearby their house, so it would have been easily accessible and not locked up. So what's kind of weird about this crime scene is the fact that Joe was the only victim who was bludgeoned with the sharp side of the axe. And he was actually so mangled that his eyes were missing from his skull. Everybody else was bludgeoned to death with the blunt side of the axe. So I don't know why Joe was singled out and then everybody else was bludgeoned with the blunt side of the axe. But they did find markings on the ceiling and the wall that they believe were from when the killer was pulling the axe back, and the sharp part of the axe made markings in the wall and the ceiling. Again, this is a small house. The ceilings were rather low, so it wouldn't have been, if the killer was taller, it wouldn't have been unheard of that he would have made gouge marks in the walls. There was a piece of a keychain found on the floor in one of the downstairs bedrooms. There was also in the dining room a plate of uneaten food on the table and a pan of bloody water. So authorities surmised that the killer probably tried to clean up before he left. All of the doors were also locked from the inside, which again was a little unusual. People back then typically didn't lock their doors at night. So it was unusual that all the doors to the Moore family home were locked. Here's probably one of the oddest things about the crime scene is that the coroner, his name was Dr. Lindquist, he reported that there was a slab of bacon on the floor in the downstairs bedroom lying near the axe, and the slab of bacon weighed almost 2 pounds, so it was like a significant amount of bacon. It was wrapped in what he thought may be a dish towel, and there was also a second slab of bacon about the same size found in the icebox. Just weird. So, obviously this is a horrific crime. The community was terrified, and for the first time, and for probably most people that lived there, they're buying locks, they're locking their door, people are sleeping in one room as a group. People also started to openly carry firearms wherever they went because they just didn't know who would have wanted to do this. Joe and Sarah were, by all accounts, well-liked, upstanding citizens, so it was horrific. It was horrific, and authorities were trying to figure out who did this. Now, if you think back to 1912, obviously, DNA wasn't a thing there. They're working with very little tools to be able to put together a crime scene. Fingerprinting was a thing, but it was relatively new, and since the axe didn't have any fingerprints on it, and since, 100 people traipsed through the crime scene, unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of forensic evidence to go on. So now we're going to get to the list of suspects. And this is one thing that's so surprising about this crime is in most cases like this, you would be lucky to come up with maybe 1 or 2 suspects. That's not the case in the Villisca axe murders. There's at least a dozen suspects and different theories surrounding, who could have done it, why they could have done it. So I really had to narrow down in the interest of time, and I'm going to talk about 3 suspects, one of whom actually was arrested and put on trial for the crime, and then other 2 possibilities that I think are very plausible as to what could have happened. So we're going to start with what authorities kind of zoned in on first. So Joe had worked for many years, for about 9-10 years, for a man named Frank Jones. And Frank owned a company that sold farm equipment. He almost sounds a little bit like an Ebenezer Scrooge because the hours that Joe worked were 7 a.m. till 11 p.m., 6 days a week. So after many years of Joe working this schedule, he decided to break away from Frank and form his own equipment company. In doing so, he also took Frank's biggest client with him, who was John Deere. So there was a bit of animosity between the 2 of them, and maybe more than a bit of animosity. It was reported that it was pretty well known in Villisca that the 2 did not like each other, and would literally go to the extreme of if one of them was walking down the sidewalk, the other person was crossing the street, so he didn't have to talk to him. So there was definitely no love lost between the 2. Now, Frank Jones was still a very wealthy, successful man in his own right, and he was actually a senator for the state of Iowa. So he had a lot of political affiliations, a lot of power within the state. But this is where things get interesting. So apparently it's rumored that Joe was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. Her name was Donna. She was married to Frank's son, Albert. And apparently she was known for having a lot of affairs and wasn't very indiscreet about them. So while it was rumored that she was having an affair with Joe, we can't 100% confirm it, but it was the talk of the town. And I don't know if that's what, the straw that broke the camel's back, but there was a detective that was working on the case. His name was Detective Wilkerson, and he worked for a very reputable detective agency called the Burns Detective Agency in Kansas City. And he kind of pieced together a theory as to what he thinks happened. So he surmised that Frank wanted Joe dead. Now, whether it was Joe and the rest of his family, or whether it was just Joe and the guy that he hired went crazy, he thinks that Frank hired a man named William Mansfield. He went by the nickname Blackie, and he was from Blue Island, Illinois. So Detective Wilkerson thought that Blackie Mansfield was a serial killer and also a cocaine addict. And 2 years after the Villisca axe murders, Blackie's family was killed in exactly the same manner. His wife, his infant child, his mother-in-law, and father-in-law were all axe murdered to death, which is pretty suspect. He also thought that Blackie was responsible for murders that took place in Paola, Kansas 4 days before the Villisca axe murders. And he was actually able to get evidence and place William Blackie Mansfield in each of these locations. He got enough evidence against Blackie that he was indicted for this crime by a grand jury. But at the last minute, payroll records emerged from Blue Island, Illinois that showed that William Blackie Mansfield was working there during the time of the Villisca axe murders. So with this evidence coming into play, they had no choice but to release him because that's a rock solid alibi if he was working in Blue Island, Illinois. Now the detective thought Frank probably pulled some strings and had those payroll records forged. I imagine it would be pretty easy to pay off somebody to write a ledger that said that he was there. I mean, this is the early 1900s. It's not like they would be able to, track his pay stubs or anything like that, or track a time card. So I think it would have been easy to forge these payroll records, therefore saving Frank's skin. Now, for the record, Frank denied that he ever had anything to do with Joe's murder or the rest of the family's murder. He vehemently denied that. However, this really split the town of Villisca in two. At the time, Villisca had a majority of Presbyterians and Methodists. Frank was a Methodist, so all the Methodists were supporting Frank and saying there's no way that he could have done this. The Presbyterians were all saying, yep, he's responsible. He must have done this because he hated Joe for taking his business and supposedly having this affair. It really tore the town up. And even long after, William Mansfield was dismissed as a suspect and was let go, there was still a lot of suspicion around whether or not Frank truly had something to do with it. This ultimately ended Frank's political career as well. It was just never the same after these allegations. Interesting side note as well, William Mansfield actually ended up bringing a lawsuit against Montgomery County for arresting him, and he won over $2,000 in his lawsuit, which is crazy. So this all happened around 2016 that he was indicted, and then they had the inquiry into whether or not he could have done it, and the payroll records were discovered. So it was 4 years after these murders had occurred that he was even arrested. Now, when that kind of went to the wayside, this is when I think Reverend George Kelly came into play, because authorities were kind of desperate to arrest somebody and have somebody, held responsible for these murders. So then they started to look at Reverend George Kelly. Now, Reverend George Kelly was ultimately arrested and put on trial for these murders. My personal belief, though, is that I don't think he did it for several reasons. So one, we're just going to kind of walk through why was Reverend Kelly in Villisca anyway. So he was a minister. He was actually from England. His parents had been ministers in England. He'd come over to the States. He was married. He preached around the Midwest, and he'd been invited to Villisca by the Presbyterian minister, Reverend Ewing, to participate in this Children's Day program. So that's why he was in Villisca. He got there that Sunday. So he wasn't really familiar with the town or who the Moore family is. And this is one reason why I don't think he was probably responsible for it, is because he wouldn't have even known where they lived. But to back up a little bit, so he participated in this program. He spent the night at Reverend Ewing's house with his family. So he was there. I guess you could say, yeah, he snuck out of the house and then miraculously discovered where the Moore family lived and then found their axe and killed them. But to me, that seems odd. Also because he was such a slight man, just the physicality of this crime. Again, each victim was bludgeoned 20 to 30 times. I'll put up a picture of Reverend Kelly. He was only about 5'2" and 120 pounds soaking wet. The main reason why the police zeroed in on Reverend Kelly is because after these murders occurred, he became a little obsessed with them. And I don't know if it's just the fact that he had been there that day, and so he had, seen the Moore family and met them. But he started writing letters to the police, to the private investigators that were working on the case. He actually also went back to Villisca after the crimes occurred and posed as an investigator and got a tour with other investigators of the crime scene. So he was a little infatuated with this crime. Now, Reverend Kelly was also not a mentally stable person. He had a mental breakdown in his adolescence. He'd spent some time in a psychiatric home. So, you take somebody who's not the most stable person of all, and then they have this weird obsession with this murder. What actually caused him to be arrested, though, wasn't anything to do with the murders. In 1914, 2 years after these murders, Reverend Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. So what had happened is he had placed an ad for a secretary. A young girl answered that ad, and he wrote her back this obscene letter that stated, amongst other things, that she would have to work in the nude. She freaked out, of course, and showed the letter to authorities. He's brought in because of this letter. As they start interrogating him, I think they realize, oh, this is the weirdo that's been writing us letters about the Villisca axe murders. They start to interrogate him about these axe murders, and the next thing you know, he confesses to the crime. He later recants his confession because he said he was under duress and had been interrogated for hours from the police. So he actually recanted that, but nonetheless, he was put on trial for the murder. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and then the second trial, he was acquitted. So, again, I don't think that he had the reason or the motive. Not that people don't flip out and kill people on a whim, and there are obviously serial killers that we'll get to in a second. That's the other third possibility for this crime. But to me, it seems much more likely that this crime was committed by somebody that knew the Moore family, that they had a motive to kill, that they had the opportunity and the means to kill. And to me, I just think that lends itself more to Frank Jones hiring this William Mansfield to kill them. There's just so many things with Reverend Kelly's case that don't make sense. And I just don't feel like he did it. I don't feel like he is the murderer of this family. The third possibility is something that was mentioned at the time and then also kind of brought up again. So there have been different men talked about that could possibly, were they serial killers that were kind of going through the Midwest and doing this? And most recently, I'm going to reference a book. So in 2017, a book came out. It's called The Man from the Train, and it was written by Bill James and his daughter, Rachel McCarthy James. They wrote this book. They actually started to research the Villisca murders and were trying to solve it. And as they started digging in deep and researching, they discovered that there were a pattern of these types of murders and the same MO of the murder, like covering up the windows, covering up the mirrors, bludgeoning people to death with an axe and then covering their faces. This happened throughout the country during that time. So they believe that this murder was committed, and all the murders were committed by a single serial killer. They concluded that the murderer was named Paul Mueller. Sometimes he went by the last name Miller as well. He was an immigrant, possibly from Germany, who was the subject of an unsuccessful year-long manhunt as the sole suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in Westbrook, Massachusetts. He had actually been employed as their farmhand. So when James and Rachel started to research, they found newspaper archives detailing dozens of families murdered under very similar circumstances across the United States. They believe that Mueller was guilty of the Villisca murders as part of a killing spree that lasted over a decade. They think he killed at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents, including in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and the Paola, Kansas crimes. What they found is that all of these families live near railroad tracks. So remember when I said that Villisca had a train depot in town? They seemingly struck in the middle of the night while the victims were asleep. They used the blunt side of the axe rather than the sharp side of the axe to bludgeon the victim's head and face. The axe would be left in the victim's home in plain sight after the murders, and he would also cover the victims with blankets. He would cover the windows, and he would lock the doors from the inside. In Mueller's suspected crimes, there was often, but not always, a sexual motive directed towards a prepubescent girl. So, when I mentioned that Lena Stillinger had been found with her nightgown up, no undergarments on, could she have been sexually assaulted, or did he attempt to sexually assault her? So that's a possibility. I haven't read the book yet. It's definitely on my list now because I'm very curious. I think that that's a plausible theory, especially since the MO of all the crimes were so similar. I feel like, William Mansfield would have had the opportunity. Frank would have known the family schedule. He knew that they were Presbyterian. He knew that the family was going to be participating in this Children's Day program that night. He would have been able to point out the home to Williams Mansfield. They didn't lock their doors. Police actually found in the attic of the Moore home cigarettes that had been smoked. So they theorized that the killer had actually been waiting for the family up there and was smoking cigarettes while he waited for them to come home and go to sleep. Frank also would have had the means to hire him and also, kind of cover up everything since he was a wealthy man. So I don't know. For me, that possibility actually lends a lot of weight. But I'm not discounting the fact that it could have been the work of a serial killer as well. And if you dig into this case, you're going to see there's other suspects. There's been a handful of people in the the 30s and 40s that supposedly confessed on their deathbed to this crime. It's crazy. So there's just a lot of theories out there, and because it is such an old case, will be this June 109 years old. People have had the time to come up with a lot of theories and possibilities and really dig in deep. So where is the Villisca Axe Murder House now? So it was actually bought in the mid-90s, and the owners, using past photos and also police reports, extensively restored it to what it would have looked like when the Moore family was living there. You can actually go to their website. I'm going to link it below, and they give day tours. You can also rent this out overnight, and I looked on their calendar, and it's actually rented every weekend from now until July is the earliest opening. So I think they're doing a pretty good business there. It is registered in Iowa as a historical home, so they did get it on the Registry of Historical Homes. So that they are, keeping the spirit of the Moore family alive. I think it's important to remember too, even though this crime happened 100 years ago, sometimes it's easy to forget that these were real people. And, this is a family that this happened to. The poor Stillinger girls, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I feel terrible for their family. We will probably never know with 100% certainty what happened to them. But it is an interesting case to look in and dive into, and you can definitely go down a rabbit hole of possibilities when researching this case. So let me know what you think. If you've researched other possibilities or if you have other theories, let me know who you think might have committed this crime. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.